We typically start these things with a little introductory time for the candidate to say what they're hoping to accomplish if they're elected. So why don't we start there? You can kind of introduce yourself to our readers and viewers.
Sure. Well, I'm very grateful to be here. Thank you all for making time to consider this race and my candidacy. Was raised not too far from here in Temple, New Hampshire, a proud product of the Monadnock region, in Conval High School, where I graduated in 2001. And I suppose my motivation goes back to my student days at Conval, where I met a number of wonderful people, teachers, coaches, etc. Two particular role models who kind of set me on my course were the late former Governor Walter Peterson, who was the advisor to a student organization that my friends and I began called Democracy in Practice, the New Hampshire Youth Voter Alliance, and secondly, Granny D, the legendary reformer who walked cross country at the age of 90 for campaign finance reform. And as I was, I think a pretty typical teenager, worried about student things, making friends, making the team, getting good grades, those two people and some other wonderful teachers kind of raised my vision and helped me to take an interest in the wider world and in politics. I got involved with youth in government and this organization I just mentioned called Democracy in Practice. And Granny D in particular convinced me that the various issues I was starting to learn about and care about, environmental issues, poverty, cost of education, that they all were connected to an underlying issue or challenge of the quality of our democracy itself, whether we're living up to the ideal of one person, one vote. And she, of course, was intently focused on the problem of big money in politics as a kind of perversion of the democratic process. And so that has been, to skip ahead several years, that has been my primary focus the last 15 years. As an undergraduate in Connecticut at Yale, I spent a lot of my time, my student time, actually in the state capitol in Hartford, organizing other young people and working with other advocates to advance campaign finance reform at the state level and for the city of New Haven. And 3 years later, I began as a freshman. In my senior year, with the help of a corruption scandal in Connecticut, we made that state the first in the nation to legislatively adopt public funding of elections, and made the city of New Haven the 14th in the nation to adopt some form of public funding. And so I trained as an activist and have been able to continue. I feel very fortunate to have been able to continue since then to earn my keep building and leading nonprofit organizations that advocate for campaign finance reform, for more general civic engagement, trying to motivate young people and lower income people to find a voice and vote and participate in our democracy, and to try to be a watchdog on politicians and the government. And that brings me to this race. It's a big step, it's an audacious step as a first-time candidate running for Executive Council, our highest elected body in New Hampshire. I perceive the job of Executive Counselor to be not a partisan, certainly not an ideologue, not a policy maker, but a good government watchdog, someone who provides a final set of eyes before we sign on the dotted line to spend state money. The $5.5 billion we spend each year, most of that comes through as contracts through the Executive Council requiring their approval, as well as a responsible party to consider the appointments that the governor makes for every appointed office in the state. So I want to bring those qualities that I've developed as a leader of nonprofits, scrutinizing budgets and campaign finance statements, raising concerns with state officials, sometimes quietly through direct engagements with governors or counselors or lawmakers, sometimes publicly through letters of complaint to the Attorney General around campaign finance concerns or things like that. I want to take those skills as a watchdog to the council and be an advocate for District 5.
So you do have a background as an activist and an advocate. As you said, you don't see the executive council as having that role. So how do you balance the direction that you've been heading in for so long with stopping and being part of the process now?
So in terms of the job of the council, I have been an advocate, but not an advocate for liberal or conservative policies or substantive issues for good governance. I have tried to be an advocate for campaign finance reform that would ensure a more democratic process, and for holding politicians accountable when I feel they have not lived up to their responsibilities. So I feel that my advocacy lends itself to the kind of non-ideological work that the council is meant to do. At the same time, I have not been silent on other issues, poverty in particular, and education and the opportunity gap. I did serve with AmeriCorps before college and worked with City Year in New Hampshire, the AmeriCorps program that works on public education in high poverty schools in Manchester. And I have from time to time spoken out on other issues. And the way that I will try to marry those, you're right to point out my advocate bent beyond simply the democratic process issues, is to use the platform of the Executive Council as an important position in New Hampshire to partner where I believe it is in service to the district, to the needs of District 5, on issues like renewable energy, where the current council has blocked a number of the solar projects that towns have put forward, or issues of women's health, where for 40 years state policy was to fund these community health centers, but my opponent, I think very ideologically, has voted to block those. There are a couple of examples, substantive issues, where as a part of the leadership of our state, if I have the privilege of serving, I believe I can exercise a voice outside of the formal duties of the council, and ultimately when contracts come to our desk or appointees come, I will try to scrutinize those with a non-ideological eye to ask, is this appointee qualified for the job, whether or not it's the person I would have gone out and selected, and is this contract duly vetted, was it put out to open bid, is it a responsible use of our money, not would I have made the law in the first place that produced this contract.
In the past, we've had counselors talk about how technical and how in-depth being a counselor can become. You have thousands of pages before each council meeting to wade through in contracts that can be very bogged down with technical language, legal language. What's prepared you to handle that?
In my work these last 15 years, and my student, my academic background as well, through undergraduate and then 2 years of graduate school, I have cultivated an academic bent. After finishing my studies a few years later, I took a sabbatical of sorts, stepped back from my campaign reform work, and on a fellowship at the Saffer Center for Harvard, did an academic year studying poverty, some of it through participant observation and direct on-the-ground research, traveling on Greyhound buses, but also large portions of it just wading through reams and reams of census data on poverty, reports going back many years, other studies and analyses of that particular challenge. So I have devoted several years so far to to analysis of often highly detailed, sometimes rather bland data. And so I believe I have the critical and analytical skills to consume and hopefully make sense of and be able to make responsible judgments about those matters that will come before me, the contracts. And then in terms of my work as an executive director of nonprofit organizations, I have had to spend a portion of my time on fiscal matters, not just soliciting support, writing grants, sometimes very detailed proposals, and entering into contracts with funders, but also the policy work we have done, such as last year our release of the first Open Democracy Index for New Hampshire, which was a detailed report on civic engagement, which again took us through thousands of pages of financial disclosures through the Secretary of State's office, which we analyzed and compiled into data sets and reported on. So I feel I've had a fair bit of training in the area of analysis and particularly financial budget making and analyzing state budgets as well as my own nonprofit.
As you think about jumping into the business of reviewing contracts on behalf of the state, do you imagine that have you already formulated some sort of bottom line principles that you would apply to that? I mean, like no contracts that do X or something like that.
It's something I've given thought to and will continue to think about. I am concerned that the approach that my opponent, Mr. Wheeler, seems to take is, I perceive a rather ideological opposition to state spending as a starting point, and then what seems to me to be his sole criteria in weighing contracts is the cost. And it's nice to see a low figure, bottom line figure at the bottom of a contract. But I think there are other important criteria that should be considered that I will look for. There's an alternative to lowest cost contracting that looks at best value contracting. This has been developed by folks in the labor community who do have an interest, of course, in receiving work that doesn't just that takes into account living wage requirements and basic benefits and things of that sort. So my starting orientation is a belief that we as a state are all too often penny wise and pound foolish. We look for the lowest upfront cost, and we fail to make smart investments in the form of living wages, in the form of reasonable environmental requirements, sustainability requirements, which end up costing us more in the long term. So in these contracts, I would try to apply a best value criteria, not necessarily preferring the lowest bid, but looking at the one where we are providing some preference. We're obviously concerned about quality of work and the qualifications of those who would carry out the work. Are they adequately trained? Where we're looking for some just working conditions, living wages, benefits, environmental impacts, etc. That's the philosophical kind of grounding that I bring to this. How exactly I would implement that, I need to work on more.
I wanted to sort of follow up on this theme that's been building on this push for nonpartisanship, or at least non-ideological drives. Because in the past few years there have been several votes that have been very partisan and haven't seemed to be very partisan. And the other thing is that you've been mentioning certain positions that that your opponent has taken in the executive council as ideologically driven. But isn't it also kind of the case where one person's rational argument is another person's ideological crusade? And if we talk to your opponent, you might say the same about your positions. So in that climate where anything can be partisan, how do you actually approach votes? And how would you do that in the council in a way that would step away from this kind of ideology that you mentioned?
Mm-hmm. That's a very fair point. So I look at an issue like the Planned Parenthood contracts, the community health centers. There's one in Keene, 5 others around the state, and serving New Hampshire on the Vermont side in the Upper Valley. And these were, for almost 40 years, completely non-controversial. Since post-Roe v. Wade, we established Title XI, and as a matter of public policy, nationally and in New Hampshire, determined that we would provide, through the community health centers, basic reproductive health services and no state funding of abortions. So with all Republican councils, these contracts were approved routinely without any objections. With the Tea Party wave in 2010 and Mr. Wheeler's return to that seat, 3 out of the 5 councilors decided that they were opposed to the organization Planned Parenthood. Singling that one out, they approved these same services for other organizations, other community health centers in other parts of the state whose name was not Planned Parenthood, but who were providing essentially the same services. And that was part of what was a easily observable national campaign against that particular organization. I believe 2 or 3% of their services are abortions, so a tiny fraction, and those cannot be publicly funded. Furthermore, and I've spoken to healthcare economists, there's a lot of research to suggest that the services they provide in terms of family planning, education, and access to contraception actually reduce the number of abortions and the need and teen pregnancies. And so, although yes, I can't claim to be without any ideology of my own, I think there are many rational reasons that most citizens would support, and the polls suggest 2/3 of Granite Staters are in support of funding Planned Parenthood, where his decision was contrary to longstanding policy in his own party, contrary to the expressed preferences of citizens in this district. And so I would term that an ideological position, and I take the other view.
Okay. Is there any situation that you could see? I mean, do you see the kind of the role of approving these contracts as kind of cut and dried and sort of down to particular principles, or looking at the actual facts on the paper, or is there any issue that you might take a bigger stand with that might not be the specific financial pros or cons, but might be something bigger in terms of what the contract would mean?
I think the assumption needs to be that we have hired to state government and appointed to the key leadership posts as agency heads qualified, responsible people who are working in the public interest, and I've met enough of our department heads to believe that that is the case. I've worked particularly with DES and HHS around water contamination issues and the eastern end of this district, Litchfield and Merrimack, and gotten to know some of those leaders better in recent months. And so the assumption, I think, needs to be that we've hired professionals to put these contracts out to bid and to vet the bids that they've received and to make responsible recommendations. And while it is appropriate for counselors to scrutinize them and to ask questions, I've sat in on many council meetings and observed, I think, a healthy back and forth between counselors and the department heads putting forward these contracts. I think the presumption needs to be that they've done their job and that it is not the council's job to meddle, much less to veto policy long established by the legislature. As a concerned citizen, as someone who is particularly concerned about the opportunity gap, for instance, where children born into poverty don't have the same opportunity as others, the cost of education, environmental concerns, the cost of climate change, estimated at $8 trillion for our millennial generation. I will not be silent when important policy is going through the legislature. I will continue as a concerned citizen to work with legislators on issues that I think are of real concern to this district in particular and to the state. as I have done. But I will do my very best as a counselor. I can't claim complete objectivity, but I will do my very best to be that watchdog, ensuring that the contracts are responsible, not making policy on the council.
Just to flip that question around, if a Republican governor comes in and the Republicans maintain majorities in the legislature, would you, a contract were put forward that was, stamped by a Republican governor and the legislature, right? Would you would you agree to fund that? Would you vote for that, even if it went against your principles, if the fundamentals of that contract were solid?
I would lean strongly toward doing so.
Okay.
I think the cases in which a council can use its rather extraordinary power to effectively veto the legislature, I think that is very problematic, and those cases should be very few, if any. So I would need to be able to argue persuasively to the public, to my constituents, that this contract, which is the result of a due legislative process and has been appropriately put out to bid, et cetera, that this is going to materially harm the public interest in order to take such a stand, and I would strive never to do so.
Dan, the council is meant as a check on the powers of the governor, and more often than not, that happens only when the majority of the council is the opposing party. Is that a bad thing?
I'm of two minds on that, to be honest. I think that it can fill a very important function, and it certainly doesn't hurt to have an extra 5 pairs of eyes, making sure that we've dotted our I's and crossed our T's and are spending our state money responsibly. I am concerned, and one of my motivations for running is that we have seen 3 individuals subvert the will of the legislature, which is a better proxy for the will of the public, I think, than those 3 individuals can be, by effectively vetoing certain acts. So I think there are examples where I think the council has not served our state well. And it's a very unique arrangement. We're the only state in the nation to have so powerful an executive council. I believe only 3 states have a council at all, and their powers have been curtailed. So I think it does raise challenges. I'm not proposing that we do away with it, but I think the approach councilors should take is, again, not one of making policy, but simply being a final check to ensure that we're spending money responsibly and to be an advocate for the district in other ways.
What do you think the level of scrutiny in terms of the financial threshold of the contracts? It's been raised to $25,000. Was it good to raise it? Should the net be wider? Should it be narrowed? Should we raise it higher?
So $10,000 for personnel, $25,000 for others. I think that was a good move. I think to think that counselors should review literally every penny in state spending is just I don't think it provides much benefit when you talk about contracts at such a low threshold. I'm not ready to propose, having not sat in that seat and myself spent time in those contracts, I'm not ready to propose that it should be raised higher at this time. But I do think it's appropriate for counselors to focus particular attention on the largest and most significant contracts. Medicaid expansion will be probably the most significant one to come before the council next year, and that's something I will be particularly focused on if I have the honor of serving. I think, again, the presumption should be we've hired and appointed civil servants working in the public interest, so to scrutinize the smallest of contracts in great detail seems like a inconsistent with trusting a civil service.
There are projects on the Department of Transportation's 10-year highway plan that are get pushed back 15 or 20 years. What does the state need to do to adequately deal with the infrastructure problem that we have? And is there a greater role that the council might play in facilitating that?
Thank you. As you know, the council has the two very public duties of approving contracts and appointments, but is also the keeper of the 10-year transportation plan, among other duties. I do believe, I briefly alluded to this, but my starting point is a belief in the idea that there is an important place for public investment, that public investment done wisely breeds private investment and private sector growth. And we've seen important examples of this in our past, like the National Highway System, which my great-granddad was very involved in as Commerce Secretary under Eisenhower. He was a Republican, but considered it one of the greatest achievements of his life to facilitate this massive public investment that led to untold economic growth in the private sector. And so I look at projects, I'll mention two in particular, which I think have catalytic potential to expand our state economy and keep our young people in state. We're the fastest aging state in the nation. Those are broadband and commuter rail. With respect to commuter rail, the most viable proposal would not reach Keene, unfortunately, or most of the geography of the state, but would add 4 stops, extend the Lowell line with 2 stops in Nashua, Manchester Airport, and the Manchester Mill Yard downtown, for an estimated cost to New Hampshire of between $4 and $7 million per year, to both cover a construction bond over 20 years plus a modest subsidy to maximize ridership. We would receive in return, according to the best study we have, commissioned by our Department of Transportation, 5,600 permanent jobs, $750 million in new real estate development, close to 2 million square feet in new commercial space. That would be a game changer for New Hampshire. And one of my motivations in running is the fact that Mr. Wheeler used his position on the council to block even the smallest step, which was receiving some federal money to study the matter in 2011. And he's remained opposed to this. It's an example of something which is profoundly in the interest of District 5, in my view. It would be a catalyst for Nashua and Manchester and the surrounding areas. And if we used it, treated the rail stations as the hubs that they ought to be by expanding rural bus service from areas as far west as Keene along Route 101 and other outlying areas to connect them to that line, I think it could, its benefits could extend far beyond that capital corridor. So that is, for me, a very important issue with tremendous potential. Broadband, part of what makes New Hampshire special is we are a rural state. We offer tremendous quality of life. Our workforce is changing. Connectivity is essential for the knowledge economy, and so if people could live in smaller towns and cities like Keene, but viably work for international companies through full speed broadband, that too would be I think an investment that would reap great returns.
With respect, you were talking about with commuter rail, it almost sounds like it's you're speaking as a legislator and not as executive counselor. You gave us some specific figures between $4 and $7 million. Are those is that your hard? Are those like the brackets that you're setting up for this, or would you accept accept contracts for that might vary from that along those lines?
I can't say that is the absolute range, and that I would therefore consider nothing else. But this is the result of work done over the last couple of years by the New Hampshire Rail Transit Authority, which has costed this out. Total build cost estimated at $246 million, of which there is federal money available for which this project is uniquely qualified, adding up to $174 million. Many millions in kind costs that would be covered by the MBTA, and the Rail Transit Authority has had extensive meetings with the MBTA.
I guess my question is just: are you flexible with what it might turn out to be?
I would certainly consider, any sound proposal for commuter rail. what I would say is that this figure, 4 to 7 million, is the result of a lot of work that has gone into this to cost this out. And I believe that we could provide the service within that price range.
And just to hold you again, is there an upper threshold to that? Is there beyond 7? Is there like an 8, 9, or is there a point where you would say this is irresponsible?
I'm not prepared to give a dollar amount.
Okay.
Certainly, we cannot have. There must be a limit. The reason that I support this project is because with the best information we have today, it would provide significantly greater returns than the cost. If the costs go up significantly, the returns, of course, go down, and potentially to make it unviable or unwise.
Dan, one of the other duties of an executive counselor is to sign off on appointments of judges, notaries, department heads. Typically, you would imagine a counselor doesn't know most of the people whose resumes are plopped in front of them. What would your approach be to vetting appointments?
I have not served in this role. I will have a lot to learn if I am elected counselor. I have sought to learn more about it by attending several meetings and by sitting down with, in particular, counselors Chris Pappas and Colin Van Ostern, who've been generous with their time in helping me understand the role better. And from what I have learned so far in my own intuition, I believe that a counselor should extend an invitation to any appointee. There's roughly 300 positions that the governor fills on citizen boards and commissions, as well as the very high-profile agency heads and judicial appointments. But I would extend an opportunity to any of them to speak with me. And for those appointed to fill those top-level positions, heads of our agencies, state Supreme Court nominees, and other judicial nominees, I would seek a meeting with them to learn more face-to-face beyond their resume. And if we elect a Republican governor who doesn't share my party, I again would strongly seek to support the appointees that Governor Sununu would put forward. I can't say as a blanket matter that I would not have questions or concerns about anyone, but again, if the person is qualified to fill the post, whether or not their politics are the same as my own, if they would do a good job and spend our public monies wisely, I would seek to support their nomination. And so again, not using a partisan or ideological test, as I believe the incumbent has done in a few cases, but looking to their qualifications and seeking to understand face to face where they're coming from.
We talked a bit about partisanship earlier, but there's another facet to the political nature of being elected an executive counselor, and that is that you then have constituents. So District 5 runs from some of the towns in our region, small towns here in the western end, all the way over to Nashua, one of the largest cities in the state. How would you foresee balancing some of the interests of what could be, in some cases, very divergent needs of people in a town like Temple or Windsor or Mason with Nashua?
And I can't pretend that there wouldn't be tensions there. No doubt there would be. I think that the answer begins with something that we talk about but don't necessarily practice very well in politics, which is listening. I briefly alluded to the sabbatical traveling around the country on Greyhound buses. Frankly, the way that I was safe those many miles, about 10,000 miles, and my wife had her questions, was by coming into every interaction not with an agenda, but with two open ears. And I was often moved by people's willingness to just share from their experience when they sensed that I was really willing to listen. I have said many times on the campaign trail, and I've visited all 33 towns in the district at least once, most of them multiple times, and I've said repeatedly that my first promise is I will return your call. It is something which my opponent is famous for not doing, and I will not ask your party or your background or anything like that. I will listen to what you have to say. In addition to that, I believe that I am suited to serve in this role, although I'm young and new to electoral politics, in part because of my upbringing as somebody who grew up in the Monadnock region and received a good public school education here. Conval draws from 9 towns in the area, and who now, because my wife was born in a much bigger city and wasn't quite ready for the country life, we live in the relative big city of Nashua. And so I have deep personal connections to those 2 poles, if you will, the small towns and the city of Nashua. And I am formed out of those towns. And so not only do I have many continuing relationships, my mom still lives in Temple, and plenty of childhood friends, teachers, acquaintances with whom I stay in regular contact. But I have, I think, a sense of the values and needs and concerns of the towns as well as the city of Nashua.
And then the other side of that question would be, so you have a discrete district that you represent. How do you foresee balancing the needs of that district versus the what's best for the state overall in the role of as a counselor?
My first responsibility is to represent the 32 towns in the city of Nashua. And so, issues like commuter rail or the NED pipeline, where there is arguably a state interest in importing more energy supply, but there's a profound local concern through the 17 towns that the proposal would have affected. I think the preference does go to the district, even if in some cases I don't agree. If there is strong public support or opposition for a project for which the state interest could be argued on the other side, I do need to give preference to this district. I am charged with representing this district. But I would seek harmony as much as possible, and I think there's an interesting balancing act that any elected official plays between being responsive and representative of current opinion, but also providing leadership to move public opinion in what is hopefully a positive direction. And so I'm not saying that's an easy balance to strike, and I'm sure I will experience that tension plenty of times, but I think a combination of earnest listening and hearing of people's concerns, but also making the case where I think the district needs to view things a little more broadly from a statewide perspective or even a national or global perspective. Something like climate change, where NIMBYism is a powerful tendency, particularly if we talk about siting wind farms. Concerns in Antrim, which are understandable, yet there is a profound concern about the reality of climate change and the need to transition off of fossil fuels to clean renewables. So there I have sought in this campaign and will continue to seek, if elected councilor, to persuade my fellow citizens that things which may be locally undesirable are in our broader self-interest, and try to balance as best I can those local concerns with a broader public interest.
So I just want to throw in this thing. You're running against an incumbent. I just thought, for the benefit of our readers, it'd be good if, in under a minute, possibly, you could list all the votes. You've been sort of mentioning them, but list the specific votes that David Wheeler has made at the Executive Council that you would have opposed. I noticed you have a little sheet, so
Sure.
figured that-
Happily, I mentioned Planned Parenthood. I would strongly support those contracts. Commuter rail, I not only support but advocate for taking this step on behalf of our state's economy, and certainly allowing the studies to proceed. And if the proposal itself is done responsibly, supporting that too. Maybe the biggest challenge facing our state right now is the opioid epidemic, and there are a lot of things we need to do, which I would happily discuss my current ideas, but the single biggest intervention is Medicaid expansion. It passed the Executive Council previously when we had a 3-2 Democratic majority, and Deborah Pignatelli was counselor for this district. But Mr. Wheeler has taken the pledge from Americans for Prosperity that he will oppose Obamacare in all forms, including Medicaid expansion. So that might be the single biggest, most important difference. The final one I would mention is renewable energy, and he has consistently voted down solar arrays put forward by cities and towns to reduce their energy costs and transition off of fossil fuels, even though there's no tax money at stake. And I would strongly advocate for that we go much further in the direction of renewable energy.
Okay, great.
One other relatively current issue has been the contract with the mental health providers, and I'm wondering, as you watch that unfold, how you analyze it and where you would come out on that.
I'm very concerned about what Dartmouth Hitchcock has unfolded in the last several weeks. The fact that they made their case successfully to receive the contract to staff the state hospital in Concord, and only days later disclosed that they were laying off a fifth of their workforce and in severe financial straits. I understand there are, business imperatives and they need to stay solvent, etc. But to not reveal that to the Executive Council when they were in the final stages of a critical contract, and we know the very delicate state of mental health services in New Hampshire, even if they fully staff the state hospital in Concord, that is the result of drawing down 15 or 20 mental health professionals from the Upper Valley and here in Keene who have been diverted to Concord. So that has significant local effects, and overall we see a severe shortage of mental health professionals in New Hampshire. So hard to undo in retrospect. I can't say that I would have opposed that vote. There were no other providers standing by to staff the state hospital, and I believe we need to take a more long-term view, and I would put part of the blame for the deterioration of mental health services, which not too long ago were considered exemplary in New Hampshire. I would put part of the blame on the O'Brien budget, which severely cut back funding, double-digit reductions in HHS funding 4 years ago. And to me, again, it is an example, as is the opioid epidemic, which is closely related to mental health. I've toured a number of nonprofits that provide both mental health and substance misuse treatment, and they allege that virtually everyone who is in an overdose situation has mental health struggles too. I can't say that scientifically, but they are certainly related. I would bring it back to this larger point that there are areas where we as a state ought to publicly invest, and healthcare is clearly one. Medicaid expansion is of utmost importance in my view, and mental health services as well. Did I answer the question?
Well, you said you had concerns about what Dartmouth Hitchcock did. I think other concerns were raised that what didn't seem to have been bid out as competitively as some people would like. So is that a troubling aspect to you too?
That does trouble me too, and I can understand the fact that there were not other bidders seemingly ready to do so, and I think that if you look at the low wages we pay mental health professionals, the inability to attract them to New Hampshire for reasons that extend beyond pay, that partly explains why we have such a shortage. So I think we need to structurally look at the need for these services, and that may require making greater investments through HHS to increase pay and create other incentives that can bring them to the state. So I wish there was a competitive bid. There were other providers that could increase the quality of care, well, not just in Concord at the state hospital, but the community health centers.
So not to put words in your mouth, but this might be an instance where your tendency is to give deference to department heads in recognition of their expertise. This is an area where you think you probably would be asking some hard questions before going ahead.
Yes, and I think any contract is fair game for the council to ask hard questions, and I laud counselors in both parties as I've sat in meetings doing so to various agency heads. This one, I think, goes to the top of the list in terms of the need for scrutiny and for systemic changes in New Hampshire and how we fund mental health services. Thank you.
I had a quick question. This may not be it is not directly related to the duties of an executive counselor, but in your opening remarks, you used a word that I haven't heard yet in all of the edit board interviews and candidates we've had come through here, and that was poverty. And maybe it's just from your advocacy background, but are we missing something? Is this a topic we should be talking about on the campaign trail?
I believe it is. I mentioned this research project that I did in 2012 and 13, which took me through 30 states, including large parts of New Hampshire. We saw in the aftermath of the O'Brien budget, which of course coincided with the Great Recession, so we cannot put all the blame on him, and it's difficult to tease out causality in these cases, but we saw a tremendous spike in child poverty in New Hampshire, a 70% spike over 2 years after 2010. Again, I'm not claiming causality, but there is undoubtedly some relationship to the severe reductions in services through HHS. I worked in Manchester with the City Year organization, which serves at that time 6, and we've now expanded the number of elementary schools. Some of them have more than 90% of their students on free or reduced lunches. So we have a phenomenon which Robert Putnam talked about in his recent book, Our Kids, and I've been part of a kind of response to that in New Hampshire called Our Kids New Hampshire. Have been honored to actually be part of a group with both gubernatorial nominees, an interesting cross-partisan gathering that came about during the presidential primary. And as he points out, we have this phenomenon of kind of concentrated poverty, intergenerational poverty, greater segregation between poor communities and the rest of us. And it's something I witnessed starkly in Manchester, where the child poverty is still above 20%, although it's significantly lower in statewide. In particular schools, as I mentioned, those in under or close to the poverty line who qualify for free and reduced lunches were a large majority of the student population. And issues like, in one of our schools, a 7th grader engaging in suicide attempts, being severely depressed, from broken families. I mean, things which we associate with inner cities in kind of their worst guys in this country are occurring in our own state. And I know it's not just an urban phenomenon in Manchester or Nashua, but we have real rural poverty as well. I don't know how the Executive Council fixes it, but it's something which I guess I've seen enough of to be very concerned about. And I believe there's the potential for more bipartisan work. I go to church with a lot of folks who don't tend to vote Democratic, but who are very concerned about issues like poverty and child opportunity. And it's something where I have sought in modest ways and hopefully more ambitious ways in the future to build some cross-partisan alliances. And at least for kids, we can all agree that no child should be raised in poverty. At least for kids, we should be able to win both sides to greater investments in early childhood education, full-day kindergarten as a universal service in this state, and better services targeting families, especially single-parent families that experience poverty. I think in New Hampshire, a single mother is at least twice as likely to be living in poverty with her kids as is a two-parent home.
Well, on that note,
On that upbeat note.
I wonder if I could just follow up quickly on
Yeah.
one answer you gave previously on how you would assess appointments, and it was sort of broadly framed and responded to. I wonder if you could be a little more specific about judicial appointments.
Thank you. Another reason that I chose to run, broadly I have felt unrepresented by Mr. Wheeler, and I think that's true of a lot of people in District 5. But was his decision, and he was joined by the two other Republicans last year, to oppose the nomination of Dorothy Graham, a longtime public defender in Manchester who appointed to district judge, supported publicly by the chief of police and by others who had sat opposite her in court, who was opposed on the grounds that she had done her job. She had provided the constitutional rights to indigent people who couldn't afford legal representation, including people who had committed crimes and done bad things. And not only do I think that is not a justifiable criteria on which to reject an appointee, she did her job. More than that, I think she is just the kind of person we should be looking to bring into positions, important positions in the judiciary or elsewhere in the civil service. Part of this Open Democracy Index that my prior organization put out last year looked at gender imbalance in representation in state government. On the electoral side, about 3/4 of the House is male, about 2/3 of the Senate, all 5 executive counselors. I'm not helping in that regard. But that is also broadly true of appointive offices. And I think we should be looking for, although it wouldn't be my job to make appointments, I think it is within the purview of the council to recommend individuals to form hopefully a good working relationship with the governor and be able to put names forward. And I would look for more women, more people from low income or minority backgrounds, or people who have devoted themselves to public service in the way that Dorothy Graham has. And because there is no impartial individual. Every judge brings their biases. To dismiss a judge on criteria like empathy, as we heard with the Sonia Sotomayor hearing some years back, is I think wrong. So I would seek out people like Dorothy Graham who bring a diversity of experiences, not just a by-the-book lawyer, but somebody who's worked with people struggling to get by, to bring more diversity to those important positions.
And then if say a governor presents his or her own nominee, and it's somebody who has a judicial philosophy that maybe you don't agree with, but is otherwise judged by Bar Association relevant people to be legally competent as a legal practitioner, if that's the right way of phrasing it. How do you assess that situation?
I cannot say that I would automatically accept every qualified appointee a governor makes, but I would place a strong preference on trusting and deferring to the governor's judgment. And if the governor is of the other party, but won a democratic election, that is the governor's prerogative. So I don't think it should be a place to kind of grandstand on ideology. I cannot say there would be no cases in which I would raise concerns that would, in which I would feel unable to approve, to vote for an appointee. But again, in addition to Dorothy Graham, the fact that Mr. Wheeler and other counselors rejected judges who agreed with the jurisprudence in the Claremont case. I happen to agree with that jurisprudence, so it's easy for me to criticize. but to say that because even if they never served on the bench, but they simply accept that as settled jurisprudence, to consider that disqualifying, I think is wrong. And I hope that I would have the maturity to accept a more conservative leaning judge who accepted settled jurisprudence and was qualified to accept that this person the governor has the right to make this appointment and I ought not stop it just because I disagree with some of their philosophies.
Okay, now, on that note, with that, I'd like to thank you for coming in and letting us know more about yourself and your candidacy. And wish you good luck.
Thank you so much for your time. I know I rambled a bit. I hope it was germane, but I really appreciate the role that you play and your vetting me in this way, and I look forward to reading the result of your deliberations.